Hi there, my name is Dawn Richards. I'm here today on behalf of Clinical Trials Ontario, or CTO, and I'm going to give you a short introduction today to clinical trials. So this presentation will have a bit about the organization I'm representing, some information about clinical trials, and then some resources that are available through our organization that can hopefully help you with additional information. So briefly about Clinical Trials Ontario. Basically, we are an organization that's primarily supported by the Ontario Ministry of Colleges and Universities and Training. And our goal really is to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. While we are an Ontario-based organization, everything that I'm going to present to you today does apply to clinical trials across Canada. CTO has three strategic pillars. The first is to streamline, and that means streamlining how clinical trials take place and the processes that support them. We also engage, and that's the pillar that I work in, where we support and promote patient public engagement with clinical trials. So with means providing you with information so you can make your own decision about potential participation. It also means supporting people with being part of clinical trial teams so they can actually work with trialists and researchers to develop and run clinical trials. And lastly, we are also about promoting Ontario's competitive advantages as a place to do clinical trials. So let's move into some basic information for you about clinical trials. So what are clinical trials? That's why we're here today. They are a type of research in which people are the participants. They test health-related interventions and outcomes. An intervention is another word for treatment or therapy. And we design clinical trials so that they can answer questions about, is an intervention safe? Does the treatment improve or cure disease or help people live longer with the disease than other treatments? And does the treatment help people feel better? So those are some of the questions that we design trials to answer. So what about these so-called health interventions or treatments? So they might be on their own or in combination with others. And we often think about clinical trials, and many people think of drugs, but there are lots of other types of treatments that are also studied in clinical trials that are shown here. So they might be drugs, yes. They might be devices, so maybe an insulin pump or a pacemaker. They might be a new type of surgery, might be a different approach to radiation therapy, might be diagnostic procedures, like maybe a new imaging procedure. And they could even be things related to diet and lifestyle, like an exercise study or some type of supplement or a new approach to diet. And why do we even do clinical trials? Well, what we do is from clinical trials, we gather research data, which we also call evidence, about the treatment that we're testing. And that research data or evidence helps a lot of different people decide what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. So for example, who uses this type of research data to make decisions? Well, it might be the people doing the studies. They'll make decisions based on whether or not they will continue to study a particular intervention. It might be Health Canada that uses research data from clinical trials to decide which interventions are safe and effective for Canadians. It might be people who create healthcare policies or are involved in healthcare decisions about treatments and about how healthcare dollars are used and approaches to healthcare. And there might be other people too, like healthcare providers who change their practice based on research evidence that comes out of clinical trials. So basically, clinical trials provide data or evidence that allow for decisions to be made. And let's go back to talking about drugs and clinical trials, since that's pretty familiar to a lot of people. There are different phases to clinical trials, and sometimes you'll see some of the phases being mixed depending on again, the different things that are being studied or how the trials are being designed. But generally, we can think of phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials. You'll see that they involve different numbers of people. They usually are for different timeframes, et cetera. So we'll go through those just so that you can get a better snapshot of what these are. So phase 1, these are also called first in human studies. So it's literally the first time the drug has gone into people. And keep in mind, though, that many drugs have been studied for many years previously in what's called preclinical studies. So those are things that tests that happen at the bench side in maybe cells or tissues, and often in animals. So we tend to have a good sense that things will be safe going into people, but we also are never really sure until they do go into people. So it's called first in human. We look at small numbers of people, and this is where we're looking to establish the safety of the drug, in this case, in people. We'll have an idea of what the dose should be, but we're looking at the dose and also the side effect information. Small number of participants, again, because this is the first time that the drug has gone into people, and short time frame. And also important to know that throughout the study, the participants are being monitored. So they're providing lots of feedback about their experience. There might be tests that are happening within them during this time. So these folks are closely monitored, and if for any reason the study has to stop, it will be stopped. And then there's a decision that's made about whether or not the drug will go on to subsequent phases of trials. And that may be for a variety of reasons related to who's doing the study, et cetera. So even though things start in phase 1, they don't always end up as marketed drugs at the end of the day, or they may not even progress past the first phase. If we look at phase 2 studies for drugs, now we've established that this is safe via phase 1 studies. We look at the drug in a larger population, and it's usually in the population for which the drug is supposed to have an effect. So here we're looking, does the drug do what it's supposed to do, or is it efficacious? And we continue to learn about dose, and we're always monitoring side effects throughout all of the phases of clinical trials. Larger number of participants, as mentioned, and usually the time frame is going to be longer as well. So just like with phase 1 studies, things may or may not go past phase 2, but if all the data look good and a decision is made to take the drug to the next phase, these are called phase 3 studies. They're sometimes called randomized clinical trials. And that's when we're comparing 2 or more interventions, or so-called treatment arms, next to each other. And they're called randomized because the participants in these studies are literally randomized or assigned by chance to one of the interventions. And that's done to reduce bias when the data are looked at from the study. So here we're looking at how long do the effects of the drug last. We continue to learn about dose and side effect information, as I mentioned before. And here we're generally looking at thousands of people and a much longer time frame. And after phase 3 studies, if the investigator or sponsor wish to and things look successful, they can provide a data package and apply to Health Canada for the drug, in this case, to be available widely and marketed widely to the Canadian public. Phase 4 clinical trials for drugs, these happen after Health Canada has approved, in this case, the drug for wide-term use by the Canadian population. So they're called post-marketing surveillance. These are approved medications. This allows us to study the long-term effects as well as side effects in a very large number of participants. And these typically have a time frame of years where they're ongoing. So sometimes people get worried about the placebo. Am I going to receive the placebo? What is the placebo? A placebo is an inactive therapy, and it looks exactly like the active therapy. So you wouldn't know the difference by looking at the two of them. However, placebo is not intended to have any effect on the condition that's being studied. And just like we talked about with randomization, the placebo is used to make the results of the study more reliable. So it decreases the bias of the study. And important to note that if there's a standard of care for a condition or disease, then very typically the placebo would not be used. And so it wouldn't be ethical in those cases to use a placebo when there's already an effective and safe medication or therapy for a particular condition. So important to know some of those facts about placebo. So that's a bit about the basics related to clinical trials. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, looking for a clinical trial and things to consider around that. So I probably don't need to tell you, if you're watching this, some of the reasons you might be looking for a trial, but it might be because you or a loved one lives with a condition. You may just be interested in research. And also worth noting that healthy participants, for example, in phase 1 studies, can be provided with compensation to participate. So remember that phase 1 studies are first in human. So these individuals are taking a bit more of a risk, as this would be the first time that the intervention is tested on people. And so it's deemed okay to compensate these individuals for that additional risk that they're taking. There are other options that you might wish to consider in addition to clinical trials. One option might be receiving no treatment, might be receiving the standard treatment or a different form of treatment than what you're currently on if you're living with a disease or condition. And you may wish to just participate in a different type of research study. It's important for you to explore those options, to ask lots of questions about what the potential benefits and risks may be associated with these options. And the person who's most likely to be able to help you out with that is likely your physician or trusted healthcare provider. So how you might find a clinical trial, your healthcare provider might be fairly knowledgeable and they might be able to help you out. You could ask a health charity or patient organization such as the Brain Tumor Foundation. I know they do lots of work in addition to what we're doing here today to help their community understand more about clinical trials. You might contact a hospital or an organization that does research in this area. You might hear ads in different media platforms. And at the end of the talk, I'll show you our clinical trial finder, which you might find useful. And this is a tool that we develop with patients, with health charities and patient organizations. And what are some of the things you should think about, again, when you're making a decision about potentially participating? These are some of the things you should look into for yourself. Are the costs of the clinical trial covered? So a red flag would be, for example, if you were asked to actually pay for the study treatments, that should be part of the clinical trial. You should not be asked to pay or provide some kind of entrance fee or something like that. But you may have to pay for some things out of pocket. That may include parking if you have to go for in-person site visits. It might be a meal while you're there. It might be gas. Those may be covered, but again, those are things that you should ask about. If I'm going to participate, is this going to cost me? And what might it cost you? And are you okay with that? Do your homework on the team. Are you satisfied with their qualifications? Have they been doing research in this area, or are they seen as experts in this area? What kind of affiliations maybe do they have with academic or community centers? So check that out. And then the clinical trial does have to be approved by a number of different, I'll call them groups. So one is Health Canada, the regulatory agency. Another is a research ethics board, and the REB's job is to look at it from the participant lens and their safety and well-being. And then the clinical trial does need to be reviewed and approved by the institution or organization where it's taking place. And if you're satisfied with all of those things, you still do need to meet the eligibility criteria to be in a clinical trial. That might be things like be a certain age range. It might mean that you're on or have never taken a certain medication. The eligibility criteria will be different for each clinical trial, but that's something that you'll be able to establish by looking at that criteria and potentially having a conversation with someone about it. This concept of informed consent and withdrawal from clinical trials, these are really key for people to understand. So part of that is that consent is voluntary. It's up to you to decide if you wish to participate in a study or not. You can also decide to withdraw from a clinical trial at any time. That should, you might be asked questions about that, but ultimately that's your decision. And consent is an ongoing process. So it's not just signing a consent form, it's asking questions throughout your participation, making sure that you're satisfied with the responses, you feel informed about what's going on. So if you do decide to withdraw consent, you can request that your data be withdrawn from the study, as well as any samples that you provided. It might be a urine sample, it might be a tissue sample, a blood sample. And just depending on the circumstances of the trial, you may or may not be able to do that. You can ask for it. The other thing to consider when you decide to withdraw, or if you're thinking about withdrawing, is to ask some questions from the study team before you do that. And you might also need to undergo some tests to make sure that you can withdraw safely. So just be aware of some of those things if you do decide that withdrawal is something that you would like to do. Keep in mind that all clinical trials have potential benefits and risks. Obviously, the risks are tried to be minimized, but there will still be potential risks. This is a really personal decision, so it's really up to you to make the decision if the potential benefits of the study might outweigh the potential risks. The potential benefits and risks will be described in the informed consent form for you. Nevertheless, you should ask lots of questions. Even if you read the informed consent form, you're aware of what they are. Continue to ask questions until you feel satisfied with the answers that you're getting about potential benefits and risks. Lastly, I'm just going to wrap up so that you're aware of some resources that are available. Everything that I've talked to you about today is available on our website, www.ctontario.ca. It's in this dropdown under Patients in the Public. Again, I just want to reiterate that while we're an Ontario-based organization, all of the information that I've provided and that's within our website is applicable to clinical trials all across Canada. We have created all of this information in collaboration with patients, health charities, and patient organizations, and it's also available in both English and French for you. This is our clinical trial finder that I spoke about a few slides ago. So this is an application where if you'd like to search for a clinical trial, you can look for trials in any province or territory in Canada, as well as Canada as a whole. It's pretty simple to use. There's also a video on the front of it that's actually narrated by a brain tumor survivor who works really closely with us. And again, I'm always happy to be contacted. If you've got any questions, my email address is down in the right hand bottom corner for you. Our website is down here. And I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to the Brain Tumor Foundation for having me here to tell you a little bit about clinical trials today. Thank you.